And finally, from the panel is Marta. I think is going to talk about the broad context, this kind of linking question between LGBT rights and the much broader landscape of human rights.
Okay, so what I was asked to do was act a little bit as a discussant, as somebody who's sort of listened to the various conversation and put forward some thoughts for the discussion. And I come at it not as an expert of LGBT rights as such, but having done quite a bit of work over the years around issues of human rights and governance, and more generally on how to work on domestic political processes in a number of countries. So what I'm going to do is share a few thoughts and perhaps throw some challenges in that we can all maybe think about in the discussion. I think there are two main ways, and this may well be a bit simplistic, but I think there are two main ways to think about how aid and donors can do something about LGBT rights in different countries. One is conditionality, aid conditionality, and the other one is trying to use aid to fix a problem. And it's interesting that obviously there is a tension between the two, because one is about taking away the money and the other one is finding ways to use it better. But let that aside. I was struck by the level of consensus that there seems to be in the room about the Jessica's call for no conditionalities, please no conditionality. I'll be quick on that. Everything I've learned in doing work around human rights and development suggests that political conditionality to aid, attaching conditionality to aid, political conditionality doesn't really work very well to improve human rights outcomes. That might be a bit of a broad statement, but the evidence and literature suggests that. There are different reasons, issues around coherence, how feasible is it really possible to have a way to coherently give or do not give aid, depending on different aspects of the human rights agenda. There is the famous sort of carrots and sticks, and whether there could be, the sticks don't work that well, and is there more than one can do to encourage change? And I'll come to that in a minute. But perhaps the one issue that I find convincing around, taking a different approach is that really aid alone doesn't change things. I mean, we have heard a few comments about that before, and it strikes me that when if donors are concerned about the way in which a country treats the lesbian and gay community, rather than thinking about a country being a donor, as we should think much more about what influence power a country today has in this new global arena where power relationships are shifting. So think about not just aid, but for example, trade rules and some of the other ways in which sort of the old rich countries interact with the old poor countries. But perhaps as a couple of examples from Norway have emerged, also about the influencing powers that countries have on the global sphere when it comes to negotiating UN resolution, or spending some political capital in some negotiations when it comes to global or regional processes. So, sort of removing aid or sort of attaching conditionality to aid doesn't seem to me like a very effective strategy if it is not related to a broader political strategy for engagement and a position that a country can take. What does strike me about conditionality, and we see it in the UK time and time again, is that I think it's pretty clear that a lot of it has to do with winning the trust of voters back home, right? And I think there is a crisis in the aid world about justifying aid and aid budget, and in a way, reassuring the taxpayers that you're not going to give money to the countries that do bad things, I think is one way of trying to address that problem. I personally think that if politicians think that would be enough to sell aid to constituencies and voters, they're not going to win much support. So even on that, I'm not sure is a particularly successful strategy. So moving on quickly to what can be done to fix the problem then. I think I've heard two arguments today that really persuade me and that I agree with. One is something that Kevin and others have mentioned in the previous session, that donors do tend to overestimate how influential they can be in influencing what is fundamentally a domestic political agenda. And the other one, which I think Jessica in particularly highlighted, and I find particularly convincing, is to look into what's happened recently in the pushback on LGBT rights as an example of a broader political problem, where people that are political actors and very politically smart are using it, whether to scapegoat or to actually introduce even more damaging changes that have potential effects to an even broader set of the population. So to really think about this phenomenon as part of a broader political context and trying to understand the root of the problem, which I do think requires a slightly different approach than being horrified by what's going on and trying to understand where it's coming from and what can be done to fix it. And so the challenge I throw back at all of you, and as somebody who does not work on this field so closely, is it strikes me that what we're discussing here is actually quite similar to a brood of other problems where you have fundamentally a politically complicated problem that requires reform that looks very unlikely in a number of countries, and what can you do as an external actor to facilitate that kind of reform? So to almost try to force ourselves to move away from the specificities and think about it in the context of that challenge. And here I do have a slight worry with the amount of times I've heard today, it is important to fund the grassroots. Again, the reason why I worry about it, not because I think it's not important to fund grassroots, because in a lot of work we do, we're confronted with political challenges in states that don't quite behave the way they want. So, well, let's fund civil society. Let's strengthen the demand side. There is, I think, a bit of wishful thinking going on that if we get that right, if we find the right way of putting the money where in the right side of the argument, that will work. And I think I'm not saying for a minute that doesn't matter. I'm just saying that we need to be careful not to sort of quickly move to that as being the solution to the problem. And a couple of thoughts on that, listening to some of you today, was what do we do about working with some of the power, the actors that are not on the right side of the fence, so whether it is the Conservatives, whether, those, how do we better understand what actually the coalitions of power going on that can actually change, make some, probably small but potentially useful change to address the situation. Sure, activists, play a role, but I think it seems to me there is a need to understand how activists can work with others, be it the middle classes, be it the private sectors, others who might have a stake and might facilitate reform using different models of engagement. On that, the work that we do, as I said, in a number of reform areas, increases suggest that donors on their own are not very likely, not that to be able to directly fund those groups and those movements. There is a bit of a need. Some of we call it intermediaries, or something that can, a way of funding an agile enough actor organization process that can actually go out and identify who the critical people are in a particular context that can mobilize that coalition for reform. And here, yes, it's very welcome, the call for flexible funding, probably small and regular, realistic expectation. All that stands, but my proposal to you is that that's not just because one needs to reach the grassroots, but because one needs to understand what's the best coalition that one can put together to achieve change in a country that might include different kind of actors. I was also struck by the comment about the progressive African activists that don't get much airtime. I do wonder whether, there is scope. Probably, there might not be such a difficult thing to do for the international community to help out there. Again, this is not the grassroots. There's likely to be the elites in many countries, but there is a scope to amplify that voice and make it a bit more relevant in the international political debates. Final thoughts. What I've heard about, I think from the colleagues from the World Bank, about the fact that most people who understand those issues or are active in this debate within agencies are still the lesbian and gay community. It reminds me a lot of what we learned about women and the fact that when we talk about women's rights, there's always a room full of women. That's a problem. I think we need to, our countries may well have good laws and a lot of equality on paper, but if within the way we work, we're still not quite cracking it in the way we portray it outside, maybe that's another way to think about it. It is not aid, but it is the way agencies actually behave.
Thank you very much indeed.